Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion will focus on modern management and Microsoft's tool for modern management, which is Intune. The focus of this session, though, is really to introduce two things. First, a little bit of an introduction to MDM, what it is, why we care about it, and then also to spend some time introducing Intune. Here's the agenda, kind of broken down the way we talked about, and we'll spend probably the first section, just first few minutes doing the MDM part, spend the rest of the time really digging into an intro to Intune. So as the name implies, this is an introduction. There's no intention for this to be in depth in any way, but future sessions will start to dig into some of the things you see kind of as I walk through Intune today. So what is MDM? Well, MDM is more than just these four things that I've got on the screen, but we'll use these four to kind of have some framework. So MDM itself stands for Mobile Device Management, and that makes the most sense. But sometimes I wish it would actually stand for Modern Device Management, because as we think about particularly Windows 10 systems, maybe that would be a little bit better of a phrase, right? It's not an official phrase. It's kind of something that makes sense in my mind. Right, because Windows 10 systems uniquely can be managed as traditional PCs. They can also be managed through the MDM channel, which is mobile device management, or in this case, managing those PCs in a modern way, modern device management. So when we say modern, what do we really mean by modern? So basically, MDM is a management framework that is baked into the operating system, whether that operating system is Windows 10, actually, to be fair, it was started in Windows 8.1, right? Or whether we're talking about Apple iOS, or whether we're talking about Android. All of those platforms have MDM capabilities built into the OS. Said another way, especially for folks who are coming from a more traditional PC management type scenario, and here for the Microsoft brand anyway, that's called Config Manager. There's in the MDM world, in the modern world, there's no requirement to install an additional agent on these systems in order to manage them. The MDM agent itself, again, built into the OS. Now, the MDM management tool itself, here's a little bit of a nuance, really kind of specific to Android in many ways. So while the MDM capabilities are delivered by the MDM pieces in the individual OSs, in the case of, I guess, any platform, but the main one I think about is Android, the MDM management tools themselves may add some additional capabilities beyond what is available in the default OS. We see this as we look across the Android space, and we see the Samsung Knox devices, then we see devices from other vendors, and so on. If you compare between individual just devices in terms of what's capable or what's possible for management on those devices, and then if you look across the various management tools that can work with those devices, sometimes you'll see some differences. Really, those differences are partially because of the operating system and who manufactures it. So Samsung has really put a lot of good things into their version of the Android operating system that is beyond what is in Android by itself. But then also the mobile device management tools can add some things too. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but whenever we enroll an Android device, there's a requirement to install, in the Intune world, a company portal app, right? Well, there's an equivalent type of app from other vendors. Oftentimes, these additional apps will add some functionality that augments what's there on the MDM framework for Android by itself, right? That may change as things go by, and it's an ever-changing field, but that's just interesting to note today. MDM is all about devices, so whether we're talking about Android or iOS or Windows 10, that's what we're focused on. So specifically with Windows 10, and thinking back about the traditional versus PC management, MDM is a different way of managing systems than traditionally what we would have with other PC management solutions. That's not to say there's not parity in a lot of places, right? There is, and there's really, really good management capabilities for Windows 10 through the MDM channel. But there's things in Config Manager as a product that's been doing this for years and years and years that are available through the uniqueness of the config manager client that are not currently available and may not ever be available through MDM. We'll see how things develop. That said, there are capabilities being added to MDM all the time. So just look at the different versions of Windows 10. Whenever we first released Windows 10 compared to now, significant changes in capabilities between what was first offered and what is now. So stay tuned as we go forward, but MDM is all about devices, right? And MDM is a standard. So there's a working group called the Open Mobile Alliance, OMA, where all of the major MDM vendors basically agree and share management approaches. Doesn't necessarily mean that we agree, or I say we, being Microsoft, I guess we're part of it, that there's agreement in all of the capabilities that will be offered through that, but the framework itself is in common. Another term that you will hear, phrase that you will hear when you talk about the various MDM capabilities is the idea of what's called a configuration service provider. So the configuration service provider basically is an individual piece within the MDM framework that will provide services of a different type. So, for example, MDM in Windows or other OSs will have modules that will be designed to deliver certain services. There may be a security module or a security configuration service provider, CSP, that will define the settings and so on that are able to be implemented through MDM. There might be a policy CSP that will define the settings and so on, and that can be implemented through MDM, and on we go, right? One other thing to kind of highlight here, and this gets a lot deeper than we want to go into this session, but I'll mention it. Knowing what your configuration service providers are and what they're capable of is really important, because like the MDM capabilities themselves, the management tools are always evolving too, right? So there's always this tension as the people who author the operating system continue to add capabilities into management of the operating system. The mobile device management vendors also have to make a decision. What capabilities do we want to make available in our tool in a nice, clean, graphical interface kind of way so that it's fairly intuitive how to create some settings, right? And there's a lot, right? Things being added all the time across all platforms, management platforms. But there's the subset of things, again, changing all the time, that MDM is capable of actually managing that may not be surfaced so cleanly in the management tools or so directly in the management tools. That's where we get the idea of a custom configuration, which I'll show you when we get to Intune here in a bit, right? Or at least show you where it is. So just the takeaway from this part is you may be looking for a particular setting to manage your Windows 10, iOS, or Android device, and you may not find it in Intune, right? Or your management platform of choice. That does not mean that capability to offer management is not possible through MDM on that device. You need to look at what is possible through MDM on that device, and if it is doable through MDM on that device, then most likely there is a way to implement that through Intune or maybe other management solutions by using the custom option. Again, more on that as we continue toward Intune. Now, why? That's what MDM is. Why do we care about MDM? Well, kind of picking up and overlapping a little bit, enrollment. That's a big topic. That's one that we're going to just barely touch on here in this session. We'll get into that more as we go forward. The bottom line, with a traditional PC management, we're talking about putting a client on these devices to manage them. Here we're talking specifically about Windows 10, right? For device management, MDM, first of all, with Android and iOS, you're not really going to put an agent on those devices to manage them, right? Mac OS maybe, but Android and iOS, iPad, iPhone, etc., you're not typically thinking about putting an agent on them to manage them. You are going to leverage the MDM channel. With Windows 10 is where they uniquely have a choice, right? You can put the agent on or you can enroll them. The process of enrolling basically ties the device to be managed by your MDM management solution of choice. There's no client to install. There may be an app to augment the management, but even that is maybe in some scenarios not required. And then we just join in through that enrollment process to whatever your management solution is, and that device is managed. And you don't have to maintain a client. That should be very good news for those that are using traditional PC management. These have gotten a tremendous amount better in terms of maintaining client stability and health in Configuration Manager. But still, it requires managing and maintaining that client, whereas here, it's all driven through the operating system. Now, enrollment is a big umbrella topic. The ways in which you enroll will vary given who the vendor is and what options are made available, what's supported in those solutions. Again, we'll barely touch on it here in a minute, right? Again, why MDM? Corporate versus BYOD scenarios. So as devices are more and more common, as users have them and want to use them for everything, there is a need to manage whether that device is owned by a given organization and handed out to a user, or whether the user is bringing their own device into a work environment, right? We need the ability to deal with both. So in corporate environments, these are those that we don't really care about the user's data per se because they are owned by a given organization. But users who are leveraging their own device and opting to be managed so that they can get access to company data and apps and so on, mail, whatever, whenever they're using their device, we need to be careful about those devices because there is a section of data on that device that is not company owned, corporate owned. And so the idea of deciding whether a device is corporate owned, is a personal owned device is really important, right? Because we will fence things off. The management tool will fence things off differently in such a scenario. The MDM engine allows for those scenarios and works really, really well in those scenarios, so that if a user is using their own device and leaves the company, then only the corporate data can be removed from the device and none of the user's data is touched and so on. There are also implications in enrollment for whether a device is flagged as corporate or personal owned, BYOD, right? Depending on the enrollment option, a device may be immediately flagged as corporate because the enrollment option chosen, there is no personal ability to use that enrollment option, right? Example would be the Apple debt program, right? Whereas if a manual enrollment is done, then the device will be flagged as personal because it was a manual choice of the user to be able to enroll the device. Talking about the fact that devices are ubiquitous, we know this. We have sometimes seen people carrying around multiple devices. I think the highest I've seen is 6 devices on a given user, carrying them around for work. People use multiple devices. People pretty much have a device with them all the time. And users want to leverage those devices to access corporate data. So because of the demand from users to be able to use these devices, the fact that we need to still protect corporate apps and related data, then we must manage these devices and do so in a very effective way. In fact, user experience kind of goes along with management in a way too. If we have proper management in place, then we can actually enhance the user experience while also protecting both the user and the organization, the company, from loss and from data manipulation that we don't want and so forth, right? So lots of options that we can bring to bear that will benefit both parties. If you have devices that are lost or stolen, right? The last thing that users want is for certain personal things that they might have on their device to be seen and compromised and shared with others, perhaps, banking information, whatever it is. So through the controls that we have through management, we can manipulate those devices. If they're out in the field, lost and stolen somewhere, we can trigger remote wipes and so on, lots of things, right? We can enforce security policies on those devices and so on. A question that sometimes comes up with MDM, with any management solution really, but oftentimes with MDM, is will management be user, or will it be device focused, or will it be both, right? And that's a great question. Roll back to traditional PC management, right? Think about Config Manager. For years and years, the main focus of Config Manager management was the device. Yes, there were capabilities to manage the user, but until Config Manager 2012, that user management really wasn't all that all that great, to be honest, right? Even in 2012, we have added the ability, or config managers added the ability to manage users and to do so very effectively. But still, with all the config manager customers I work with, the vast majority of them still manage devices directly. But the point is, we're seeing users come more into the scope of management, even with traditional PC management. With MDM-based management, you have the same choice. Do I manage the user? Do I manage the device? And really, it's scenario dependent. Whatever you want to do for a given scenario, you probably can, right? What makes the most sense? If you have, just as an example, a retail organization where the device that is being used isn't tied to the user and we don't really care who the user is on it, it's very possible to manage the device directly and not even really factor the user into the equation. Same is true of the user. If you really care about the user, very possible to manage the user. And it's very scenario specific. You might do both user and device management, right? You may do one or the other, completely up to your needs as an organization using MDM. Now, let's shift and talk about PCs for a minute, right? A Windows 10 PC is the only choice you have where you can choose traditional PC management or MDM, right? Both of them are available. So which one is better? MDM, traditional management? And the answer truly is, it depends. It fully depends on the specific requirements. If the device is truly acting as a device, maybe we manage it as a device, right? MDM may be sufficient. If a richer management experience is required, maybe there's been business rules built around things like software metering in Configuration Manager or detailed compliance settings kinds of things, that may make a very strong argument for continuing with traditional PC management. The nice thing is, the beautiful thing is of having both options, MDM versus traditional PC management, you don't really have to make a hard and fast choice, right? So early on, whenever Intune, we'll talk about Intune here, MDM Enrollment, was first introduced, it was basically a firewall between the two. You could not manage a Windows 10 PC with both a traditional PC agent and MDM, right? One would preclude the other. With later versions of Windows 10, the ones that are out now, and latest config manager releases, it is possible to set up a scenario called co-management. Co-management is an awesome capability to bring to bear an environment, because whereas the firewall before would really force organizations into a decision one versus the other, co-management enables a scenario of both, right? Choose traditional PC management where it makes sense. If you're totally on the traditional PC management side, that's great. But let's start the journey to MDM. The journey to modern management is a journey that every organization should start to take. And ultimately, every organization may take that journey and probably will, very differently, right? That's okay. Enabling co-management enables that journey to begin, whereas not having it kind of roadblocks that journey. So begin on that journey. Find out those workloads that would benefit from modern management, from MDM, and start to see what it takes to get there. Find out what those deltas are. If modern management is totally an option that works in a given section of an organization, it's a really cool thing to implement, right? So the choice is really up to you. And if you have some things that you don't think MDM is going to match for your organization today, that's fine, right? You can start the journey anyway and keep a certain workload on traditional PC management until that capability does evolve in MDM. All right, so what are the components of MDM? This one is really, I almost didn't even put it in because it's kind of an obvious slide. The device itself, the operating system that's running on the device, is a component of MDM. That's where the MDM management suites are implemented. The capabilities of the MDM management tool is another one, right? So those two together, and I guess I should put up here for completeness the internet, right? Because MDM is managed typically, at least in the Intune world, through the internet. Other vendors have different ways to do it, but these are the ones in Intune. And probably we could get fancy and say some of the other requirements if we really dove deeply, but really not hard to get management started. Okay, So let's talk about, in the most briefest of ways, enrollment. Okay? So the only thing I'm going to say about enrollment now, because in future sessions as we build forward, we'll talk more about enrollment, is that the methods for enrollment, they vary. Some are direct, some are user initiated, and they vary not only by how you implement them, but by the device as well, right? So to give some examples of direct enrollment in the Windows world, that would be Autopilot. In the iOS world, that would be the device enrollment program from Apple. In the Android world, there's really two options. One is called Zero Touch Enrollment from Android, and the other is called Knox Mobile Enrollment that is supported uniquely on Samsung Knox devices. Then there's a big, broad category of enrollment called user-initiated. This would be, in the iOS and Android world, putting the company portal from the app stores, the respective app stores, on the device and working through the enrollment process. In Windows 10, really enrolling that device is not done through the company portal. We do have a company portal in the Windows Store, but it's done through settings, right? And the only thing I'm really going to show you here are a few screenshots. So here, this particular one is the settings node of a Windows 10 device, and it shows that we are connected to Intune. This is my login for Intune, and so simply working through settings and configuring Access Worker School is one way that users can do it. In the middle, we have an iPad, and this is just the company portal launched in the default screen. The process for enrolling is several steps for iOS, but this is the result as we have a running company portal signed in. You can see the user up here. And then this is the company portal opening on an Android platform. In this case, a Samsung device, right? So it's enrolled to, and same deal and so forth. So we will dig into these further as we roll along. And when we get to the Intune demo, we'll see these devices actually enrolled in Intune and being managed. All right, so that concludes all that I want to talk about with MDM right now. The next part of this, I just want to walk you through a very high-level introduction to Intune itself, the console, and so forth. So I'm going to open up my browser, and because of the way I do, or authentication happens here, I'm going to use it in private browser. You likely don't need to. And I'm just going to go to the Azure Portal. So the Azure Portal, Intune is a piece of Azure. Can't type and talk at the same time. Azure is the provider that hosts Intune. And so think of Azure as the big overarching cloud, and then Intune being a component that sits within that cloud. And certainly when we go into the Azure portal, we will see that Intune is just a section of that here, right? Wasn't always this way. If you've had experience with Intune in the past prior to this portal, then you would have a different URL you would go to. The portal you would launch would be a big single color background with circles along the left-hand side for navigating and so on. This is a much more robust and refined experience. So if we go into the Intune portal, then we navigate this just like anything in Azure. We'll just kind of start top down. Here we see an overview of different things. You can see I have 12 devices available. There are 83% non-compliant. What a surprise, in my lab. If I scroll over, there are some different things I can do if I want to create groups and shortcuts to tasks. And there's also this thing called the Intune Data Warehouse. So let me pause there for a minute. One of the things that you can uniquely do with Intune, if you have a config manager environment, is manage Intune through the config manager console. It's called a hybrid Intune experience, right? Where you connect config manager with Intune. There were very, very compelling reasons to do that years ago, before this new console was introduced, because certain things that folks wanted to do just weren't possible with Intune by itself, such as delegating roles to certain people so you can only view certain things in the Intune console and do certain tasks. Reporting was really non-existent, largely, in the Intune console standalone. And there were others. Those gaps and more have been closed. And so it's far less compelling, though still supported today, to manage in a hybrid. Make sure I use the right words, in a hybrid type scenario. So I'll show you the data warehouse here, because that's a great source for reporting on your data and so on. There's lots of things that we can talk about accessing data and how it works, and using different APIs, the Graph API specifically to access the data, and we will probably get to as we move along and talk about Intune in more depth, but we won't even touch today because it's way beyond where we are. And you can see that you can still, if you have a need to access the Classic Portal, you still can, but in my case, my Classic Portal is disabled because I don't have anything in there, right? Okay, so the big device enrollment section, this is where devices will join in for management in Intune. Okay, there's sections for each kind of device. So if I go to Apple Enrollment, I will see the various kinds. You need for Apple Enrollment to have what's called an APN, an Apple Push Notification Certificate. Really easy to obtain. We help you see how long it's going to stay valid, let you know when it's time to renew, etc. There's other programs. There's the enrollment program for Apple and devices and so on, profiles, and that would be the Apple DEP program, Device Enrollment Protocol. Then there's even stuff with Apple Configurator that you can enforce on the device and so forth. There's Android enrollment. So one of the variants of Android is this thing called Android for Work. So you can have standard Android enrollment. Those devices will be managed fine. There are some devices that support an advanced kind of management called Android for Work. That can be configured in the console, and devices managed that way as well. There's Windows enrollment. So here we see the ability to tap into Windows Hello for Business and do some CNAME registration and so on. We also see ties with Autopilot. We can manage most things about Autopilot here, right? The only thing that we can't manage today, maybe coming in the future, is the ability to publish Autopilot details in the Autopilot portion of Azure. That has to be done through the Windows Store for Business today, or the Partner Portal, depending on who's doing it. Other things in here, you can decide enrollment restrictions. This would be how many devices a given user is allowed to install. The default is 5, but the limit is 15. Right? There's other ways we can do workarounds for those limits too. There's the concept, so much I could talk about here. There's the concept of device enrollment managers, where you have a single account. This would be more of a scenario where you don't really care so much about the user on the device, but you want to have a ability to bulk enroll using a single user account. Device enrollment manager can do that. By default, it supports enrolling 1,000 devices. Depending on configuration, you can even go beyond that, right? And on we go, right? There's audit logging capabilities in Intune and so forth. So staying with the console, let's move to the left. Device compliance and device configuration. So think of device compliance as checking whether a device complies with a certain setting, and then device configuration as implementing those settings on the device, right? So I love this area of this console. If you've worked with the previous console, which was referred to as the Silverlight console, then you will know that sometimes whenever you went to go configure policy for the device, and that's what we're doing in both of these sections, it would become very confusing which policy applied to which type of system, etc. So I love the way that this is organized. If I want to create a new policy, I'll just go to policies, say create policy, and then I'll have to give it a name. I don't care here, but the first question I'm asked is what platform. So all of the policy options are organized by platform. Let's just do iOS today. And then you'll see all of the various settings that can be configured for a specific operating system. Well, you might look at this and think, that's not very exciting, not very many things we can configure there. Let's go look at a couple of these settings while we're here. So device health, making sure that devices are not jailbroken, making sure that devices are at a certain threat level. Device properties, making sure OS versions, again, enforcing policy on the device, making sure things comply. Other settings here, password scenarios and so forth, right? You don't think there's much there, you're correct, but let's look down now at the configuration options. And so if we go into configurations, same kind of interface, and create a profile, same kind of thing. We're going to need to answer what is our platform first, and then a subselect of the various setting profiles that can be configured. So a huge list, right? Device restrictions, perhaps we'll start there, right? And there are a lot of them, right? This is where you'll find it's very useful to understand the options that are available. Scroll through here, get familiar, etc. Look at Windows 10, then we'll see configuration types here, and so many that we scroll off the window. One thing I do want to call your attention to, I mentioned that Intune, or your mobile device management platform, will support many things in a nice UI like you see here. There are some of those settings that are offered by MDM through configuration service providers that you may not see in the UI. Doesn't mean you can't leverage them. It means that you have to use the custom configuration and manipulate those configuration service providers directly, whether that's Windows or iOS, and I've never tried it on Android, but I assume it's there too, right? So if I just look at the same classification of device restrictions that I looked at for iOS, we see tons of them, right? Lots and lots and lots of things that we can configure. So we won't go through those, but definitely wanted to show you what those were, right? The ability to run PowerShell scripts on systems. You create these profiles or policies, and you basically don't even really have to assign these so much like you would an application, because by the nature that you are creating this, let me show you one of these. I'll just go into the properties of it. This is one that I have available, and I can assign it to certain groups. Okay, so scratch what I said. I think I'm mixing a couple of topics. Forgive me, I'm jumping ahead mentally. Assignments, you create assignments on these profiles just like you would anywhere else. So let's look at this, and we can look at our assignment status and so on. So if I continue on through creating a brand new one, then I would have the ability to assign it wherever I wanted to, just kind of like you saw. Once I go into one, I can manipulate the assignments right here. Okay, once it's created, and then have all these options: save it, discard it, whatever. And I can select the groups that I care about, whether I want to apply it to all devices, all users, selected groups, etc. I can do all that here, and we'll talk about groups more in just a minute. Okay? All right, so let's keep on rolling. So now we have a devices section. And so devices will basically show all of our enrolled devices, and we can look at those devices. You can see that I have a number of systems enrolled here. These are all Windows systems. I have my iPad, I have my Android device. I can go into any one of these devices and see detail, so I'll just choose the iPad and look at some of the base information. I can look at more details in terms of hardware and discovered apps and so on. Now, I can promise you that on this device, I have more than the company portal and more than Outlook installed. Why don't I see more than that? It's because initially I had the device set to personal. I just flipped it to corporate, so it takes some time to go through and do that. Hasn't been enough time yet to do it, but that's where the personal versus corporate setting is really, really important. With corporate, we'll show you everything because it's owned by the organization that's managing it. For personal, we create that segmentation so that only corporate-owned data is brought forward for you to see, right? And again, there are ways to flag setting personal or corporate-owned when the device enrolls. So I talked about the Apple Device Enrollment Program. There's other ways too. Let me just regress here for a moment to device enrollment. So if I scroll down, there's the ability to flag certain devices when they enroll as corporate. So I can do things like add a series of IMEI numbers or serial numbers, depending on the device type and so on, import a whole bunch if you have them, and then anytime that device enrolls, it doesn't matter which enrollment method it uses, it will be flagged as corporate, right? And so on, right? Okay. Some applications. A big part of what organizations want to do is make applications available to the end user. So lots of capabilities in Intune in order to make that happen, right? So let's just look at apps, and you'll see that I have a lot of apps. I can click Add, and there are categories that I'll need to choose, okay? So first, if it's a store app, we support all three of the stores, Android, iOS, and Windows. You also have the ability to put in other types of apps, just a link to a web application or an app that's built into a device or a line of business. So for the Windows 10, that could be an MSI type application, right? Or we have a section specifically for O365. This is really, really cool. If you're deploying Office 365, there can be some configuration challenges just figuring out all the moving parts, even on a PC. But if you're trying to do that through MDM, it adds a little bit more of a layer of complexity. So if you want to deploy it to Mac or Windows, but I'll show you Mac, you can go configure exactly what you want settings-wise for that. Now, if you look at Windows, you'll see that there's even more granularity as to what you can configure, what applications in the suite you care about, the app suite info specifically that you might want to put on, the installation options in terms of update channel and different things, right? Very nice. Once you have this done, just save it and then go into the app and deploy it just like anything else to a group of devices, users that you want to target. Really cool. Other things in here, the ability to manage application experiences for the end user. So just a couple of random things I'll throw in here. There's two concepts. One, you see app configuration policies. There are multiple examples that we could use for this. One example is maybe a user is using Outlook, and instead of having to wonder how to configure their profile, you might configure it here for them and provide it to the device. So whenever the user launches Outlook, they are saying, hey, do you want to add this account? And they happen to see their name and they click on it. It has all the settings pre-populated, and it's a really easy experience. That's an example of app configuration profiles. This also makes me call out something called MAM, which is Microsoft Application Management. That uniquely applies to iOS and Android, and it requires what's called an enlightened application. So those enlightened applications are basically management enabled. And so with those kind of applications, you have additional controls over the top of what that application is able to do. Maybe it's an internet browser and you want to limit copy and paste or sites that it can go to, or on and on we go, right? Lots of different options that you can bring to bear depending, right? Okay. So I keep having the tendency to want to dive deeply into some of these, but just move it along because this is just an overview session, Steve. Okay, so just kind of moving along. So the last three that I kind of want to go into are groups. So for those who are config manager administrators, we understand that groups, or we understand the concept of collections. Collections are used for targeting deployments to end users or devices. Now they're used in the config manager world for more than that too, but that's a big purpose of what they're used for, targeting software settings, etc. Groups are the equivalent in Intune. And the groups that you see here are actually leveraging Azure Active Directory as a storage location for groups. And you have a couple of different options here. I can go create a new group, basically give it a name, give it a type and then a name, whatever. There's a couple of different types of groups. There's assigned, which is an equivalent to direct membership in Config Manager. And then there's dynamic. Dynamic groups are awesome because just like dynamic collections in Config Manager, they automatically update. Now, anyone who's familiar with the Config Manager environment and building collections will realize that there are a tremendous number of options you can use for defining criteria for collection membership. Here you have dynamic capabilities as well. The fields that you have to choose from are much reduced here compared to Config Manager. That's okay, right? I've not run into any cases I can think of where folks want to use attributes other than these to manage groups. There's also an advanced rule editor that we can leverage to build out group criteria and then membership adjust accordingly. All right. So I mentioned role-based access was a compelling reason to leverage Intune hybrid with Config Manager versus Intune standalone. And that was absolutely true. That reason really is overcome with the ability to have role-based access in Intune itself. We have all, just like Config Manager, we have default roles that you can assign users to and different permissions on each one. Now, if you don't like one of these, you can always create your custom role and see all of the permissions that you can put on a user, a custom role here. Right? All of them are available here. You can set them as you desire, and the experience will be what you define. Really cool. Software updates. So software updates is one of those things that prior to adding it to the UI, you would have to control using the custom configuration service provider. Now it's in the UI, right? So it's easy to do. So whenever we say software updates, we think of two things, really. Maybe first we think of Windows, because Windows has a monthly software update cycle and so on. How do we configure those things in a Windows 10 world? Again, this is uniquely Windows 10. Well, Windows 10 software update model is really easy, right? We get one update per month, right, that we would want to maybe deploy out for Windows 10. It's a cumulative update. So pretty easy to configure kind of a set and release kind of structure where you have multiple deployment rings and so on. We can go through and configure our settings for this. Now, what we're doing when we do this is we're actually configuring the Windows 10 device to leverage Windows Update for Business, which is really cool. It is different from Configuration Manager software updates. Right? It has a lot of similarities. And if you looked at that list, there may be settings that you would want to apply that are not present in that particular UI. Said another way, Windows Update for Business is a grouping of settings and some other ones that are kind of seem common in that area. But if you look at the updates configuration service provider and even what's in the UI of Intune, there are a number of other things that you could bring to bear to help manage updates. So if you want to augment some of the settings that are in the Windows Update for Business list, you could do that. Right? Up to you. Okay, iOS update policies. So this is the last one we'll show, but just to call out, it is possible to manage updating on iOS as well. Fewer configuration choices, but basic ones are there, such as what time zone, when the update periods will be, what days, etc. One thing I'll call out while I'm here, you notice, and we try to call this out in the console, which is really nice, is that this automatic updates requires a mode of iOS called supervised. So that's something, again, way more detailed than what we want to talk about here. But there are different modes of operation. Certain settings will require a device, an Apple device in this case, to be in supervised mode, right? And then those settings are possible. Whereas if it's not a supervised device, just a user-owned device, some settings may not be possible, right? Okay. So that really does, and we haven't even really gone deeply into anything, right? We've just very surface gone into what's possible. That concludes kind of our tour of Intune here. We're going to get into this in much more detail in future sessions, so we'll wrap the session today, and we will see you next time.